Okay, so today we're going to do a presentation that I gave originally at a conference in Liverpool last year, and then I also gave it last week as part of the Why Metal Matters project, which is something being convened by David Gange, who's an associate professor in history at Birmingham, and he's convened a series of like sort of public metal studies engagements. So I was there with him and Azra Dragonova. She's a lecturer in media studies, I think, at Birmingham City, and so we all got to present a little bit. Asia, recently edited a issue of the journal Riffs, and David talked about the Why Metal Matters project, and I represented this presentation, and it's called this. It's called the Normalising Hagiography of Ozzy Osbourne, and this is something I had quite a lot of fun doing actually last year when I did the project. I kind of just finished doing my thesis, or was like kind of about to, and all of this Aussie stuff happened. It like happened right as I was kind of finishing up, which was really kind of germane, to be honest. It provided so many examples of like what I'd kind of been pushing towards in like conceptually over the previous years, and this was definitely a part of it, because one sec, let me shrink myself down. Because Ozzy Osbourne inspired me to get a chocolate drawer. I love watching the Osbournes, He'll Be Missed, from the page Airing My Laundry, and I thought that was really interesting because of the kind of sort of elder Mumsnet type aesthetics, or like sort of boomer posting, sort of bin menism type posting, that this was connected to. And it's Ozzy obviously painted in a very kind of normalised light, just a nice guy who had a drawer full of bars of dairy milk. But let's really kind of get into that, like what's going on there. And obviously we know that the event itself was a big fucking deal, right? Like let's see, how significant is this event? The event is hugely significant. The fact that they had to ask the question, I think, is important. You know, they need to state that metal is significant. This is because that's a big revision for the BBC. The BBC not traditionally involved with reporting on metal. Metal bands traditionally in Britain not included in legitimate culture in the way that the Beatles were very readily incorporated into British culture, like heritage British culture or establishment British culture, you know, or like Oasis when they went to Downing Street in the 90s. You know, there was a need for acceptable pop culture icons for politics and establishment culture to attach themselves to, and metal hasn't really featured in that until quite recently. And so yeah, what you need to know anyway is that the event is hugely significant, and indeed one of my favourite moments of the coverage, which was really extensive, was from this guy, and he live blogged the whole of the event. You can still find the entire live blog feed, and then said, well, I looked him up on Muckrack. You know, he's done before this. He'd done some live blogging of like big concerts, and maybe one or two big concerts he'd done a live blog for, or maybe like award shows or something like that. And he'd done some pop culture reportage, but it wasn't metal focused. And anyway, he live blogged this, and he says an amazing thing, which is each time you hear a Black Sabbath song, you can just hear those riffs. You can just hear those riffs, you know? Each time you hear a Black Sabbath song, you can just hear that Black Sabbath song, which I think is good because it's revealing that the BBC felt the need to send a reporter, firstly, even to live blog a gig. That is normally something that they do for like big sports events. I'm not sure actually if Ben Sidwell had live blogged a gig before. It's a pretty unusual thing to do in and of itself. And the Guardian also live blogged, but they didn't live blog from somebody who was actually there. They live blogged somebody who was watching the stream and reacting to the stream. So they basically had a live react to the stream. Whatever, fine. But the fact that they sent a guy and then, he gets into it, maybe he has a few beers or something, I don't know, I'm not going to question what Ben Sidwell was up to that day. It seems like he was hearing those riffs at least. But like he got to this kind of Alan Partridge-esque kind of moment, where I'm not sure he was totally, this is just such clunky wording. But, all respect to Ben Sidwell and thank you for bringing this into the world. You can just hear those riffs. And then, of course, there was the other stuff that was associated with this. So the gig itself, massive, but then there was all the public commemoration. So you have this, the mural that was made in Birmingham, and it was commissioned by the Central Business Improvement. Was it BID? It's a business kind of board, or like it's related to the council. And with the support of Network Rail as well. So this is like they're making a big public mural on like a railway bridge, I think, or something. And they got this as well. They're awarded Freedom of the City by Birmingham, so it's all super officialdom. Birmingham City Council officially endorsed, and Birmingham City Uni, Birmingham Uni as well, perhaps. They're all out here endorsing Black Sabbath. This is all very, very official. Literally, look at that. You've got these official deeds or awards, and it's got the fucking Sabbath logo right there, And then there was the output. And the output is an enormous sum of money was purportedly raised for charities. I'm not sure where all of that money went. We don't know how it's dispersed. We know that there are some charities that were meant to be equally split between the Children's Hospital, Cure Parkinson's, and Children's Hospice as well. And that's obviously an enormous sum of money, which is great for those organisations. Though it's interesting that they are, apart from Cure Parkinson's is obviously something that Ozzy was directly afflicted by. But it is slightly interesting to note, I think, that the charities are local. This is for Birmingham. This is it's about Ozzy's legacy, perhaps. But I also think it is worth alighting on how like local centric, maybe even mundane, the choices in charities are. Because this kind of follows into the general portrayal of metal in the mid-2020s, which is that there are these like social causes that metal could be attached to, perhaps, and there's this kind of new sort of revised opinion of metal. Maybe metal's about doing good things, or maybe things like anti-bullying, anti-discrimination stuff, broadly construed, might be a valence for metal. This is something that's becoming more prominent, and the Back to the Beginning event fits into this, and maybe this is important because if you're going to make metal culturally legitimate, if we're going to have events like this, then maybe we do need something like this. Why do we need something like this, though? That's the interesting thing. Why do we have to enunciate that metal is doing good things? Why do we have to be so clear about that? And then it kept going, People turn up in the Guardian. Mike Watson is actually, I'm co-editing a book with him about left politics and metal. So he got a thing about metal in the Guardian and talking about, again, the good that metal can do. And then even more than that, look, there he is, Adrian Chiles, talking about metal. The teenage me loved it. Adrian, please come back. Please. I'd do anything to see an Adrian Chiles fronted metal band. Anything. Call me. So like, And then it went on and on and on. Google did something. This was an amazing story. When the Daily Mail reported on the Coldstream Guards, which was the band that stand outside Buckingham Palace, they did a cover of Paranoid outside the Buckingham Palace, like, how establishment culture can you get, and being reported on by the Mail as well, like, how establishment media do you want to be, how, like, traditionally, or, conservative, whatever you want to fucking call it, And then there was this, the Book of Condolences, and even the Pink paper, the Financial Times, did something about Ozzy Osbourne. The Financial Times are not a paper that cares about culture particularly, right? Like life and arts, indeed. It's not a big deal to them. The important things for the Financial Times are indeed companies, tech, markets. What in any other paper, this would all be compressed into finance, basically. But for the FT, these are 3 separate categories because that's what they're reporting on, yeah? But even they felt the need. And of course, the people came out in droves. And and I just went to the bridge last week when I spoke at this event, and I got the sense in which, like, Ozzy's death was for everyone in a sense, like the very big public ceremony, the gig as well, where, like, he didn't need to be that old and ill and come out there and say that and be that and do that performance. He didn't have to do that. He wanted to. And obviously there was a lot that is for him in that moment, but you can see in the memorial, like, and the fact that the bridge exists and so on, that and the way people respond, yeah, especially to the funeral, showed, I think, like, Ozzy's death was very public, and through that it becomes for the public. It becomes for everyone. And now, even when I went last week, there were still flowers being left, and I happened to bump into a couple that had travelled there from Australia, and they were sort of there to pay their respects. And you can imagine that that's going to keep happening. A lot of people just walked past, a lot of people didn't care, but some people looked at it as if to say, oh, I've never really thought about that, but there it is, there's Black Sabbath Bridge. They understand it as a piece of cultural heritage already, which is important because here we are. Metal turns up in all kinds of places now. It's getting more normal. This is what I've said often, and especially the way it has been made more normal has relied on arguments that metal is not deviant, or that the deviance in metal is not harmful, or that metal doesn't cause the harm that it was purported to have caused. And then even that metal offers various benefits for people. It's been given what you'd call instrumental rationality. We found a place for it in some broader social order. And metal scholarship has played a really big role in legitimising metal on those grounds, like saying, hey, you've misunderstood this. Actually, when you speak to metal fans, they find it very useful and they find it beneficial in this and that and the other way. I'm not saying this is necessary, this is good, but it changes what metal is through the process. Like, it's by us understanding it not as deviant but as having some rationale, we change the character of metal somewhat, or we change one part of the character of metal. We change how the people bit works, because every culture, you could say, has parts and it has people, as Margaret Archer argues. There's the works, there's the stuff of a culture, and then there's the social things around the culture or works, and these things can change. Archer's main idea basically is that, like, imagine you've got a work that is important at one period in time, and then another period in time it gets forgotten about, and it gets picked up by a different group of people and reused in a different way. Or like in a basic sense, like one way you could talk about this is like revival movements. The parts and the people are not coexistent through time. They have different time spans, basically. And the basic way to say that is that a metal album art from 1970 still looks like it did in 1970, apart from obviously individual wear and tear, but like the artifact, what it displays is the same, but the interpretation of it is going to be different over time. And that might seem like an obvious point, but it's really important to understand when we talk about how cultures work, because we do also tend to think of cultures as things which express people in some way, either their interests or like their creativity or whatever it is. And so it's this question of how do we discern like what the difference is between like when we talk about a culture, what we're talking about, and also like how can we can we pull these things apart fully? No, you can't take the parts away from the people that made them fully. Like anyone that gets into a work even after the original context has gone is still going to end up learning about that person in some kind of a way anyway. There's always going to be that connection, but they don't live the same length of time. So, for our purposes, the question is how can the establishment media, which spent years and years saying metal's dangerous and it's not good or it's not culturally legitimate or whatever, now that Ozzy died and this was an enormous public spectacle that brought thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people together, how can they recuperate metal's aesthetics which haven't changed over time, which are still bleak and miserable and disturbing and violent and all the cool shit that metal is? So to understand that, I had a look at some obituaries, and here are some obituaries that I looked at. We looked at some British newspapers, some American newspapers with a proxy. The Irish Times and the New York Times are the same, so kind of US, whatever, it was a reprint. And then you got 3 music magazines as well, big ones. I didn't find official obituaries from metal magazines because they're not major media outlets, frankly. They are niche markets. I wanted really to focus on the things that consider themselves to speak to everyone. Obviously Pitchfork doesn't think, and Rolling Stone, the music ones, especially Pitchfork, they don't think that they speak to everyone, but they think they speak to all kinds of music listeners, and I thought that was representative enough. And what I found were 2 kind of major approaches. And here's a good example from Rolling Stone of how to legitimise Ozzy. How to say Ozzy did culturally valuable things. So we talk about how good his singing is, you drop some Milton references, you make it into a big thing, you make it proper. Or we talk about, we drop all of the correct kind of cultural criticism type writing, we write about what their music sounds like a lot and like convey the importance of the music. I thought this line was very interesting though. Their vaguely occult presentation was entirely superficial. Why? Why do you need to say that? Why was it? I mean, there is of course the classic bit where the well-known story where they were approached on an early tour by some witches or like black magic types that were around and about in the late 60s, early 70s. I'm not sure if this was America or England, but they were like they dissuaded that, they were not interested, and of course also like they wrote a couple of Christian songs. But why lean so hard on this? vaguely occult presentation was entirely superficial. Don't take it seriously. And I'll return to that, but don't take it. That's what NPR is saying there. Somewhat is don't take it seriously. Vaguely. Also, guys, just noticed this actually. Not seen this before. Don't vaguely. That's a double vaguely in the same sentence. Don't do that. Or maybe the Guardian's one as well. Also, they really lent on. They talk about the stats. They're talking about. They're writing like music reviewers, like they know what they're talking about, and they're again mentioning War Pigs explicitly because they want to convey Ozzy. They want to convey Ozzy as a serious musician who did important things. Though I think Pitchfork's one is the best because they take the hipster approach and say, look, if you want to read about all of the sensational stuff that Ozzy did throughout his life, you can read another newspaper, actually. We're here to talk about Ozzy Osbourne, the guy that we loved, and it is very, very hagiographic. Like, it's not even really an obituary. It's by the guy from the Mountain Goats, John Darnielle, and he's mostly writing about, like, his love for Ozzy, how he was introduced to the band, and so on and so on. And it's nice and it's confessional and so on, but it is fawning. Like this is interesting. Under the stewardship of his wife Sharon, Ozzy's fame grew until he'd successfully infiltrated the mainstream. Never mind that Black Sabbath were a huge band early on. And did really well. He was mainstream metal as soon as MTV was launched, and And if you mean the mainstream in the sense of being on reality television, that is interesting as well because it presumes that Ozzy is kind of under the stewardship, like easily influenced. So you think he's maybe a dope? Is this we'll maybe get to that in a little bit. So that approach that was one poll that I found, and note also that all of the newspapers, NPR and the Guardian, they're both kind of left leaning. So the music rags and the more liberal publications were more interested in taking Ozzy this way, reading him as somebody that did important cultural things and said political stuff and infiltrated the mainstream. And if you want to read about the sensational stuff, you can find a different newspaper, and now we're going to find those newspapers. Because the WAPO, the Bezos paper, started by saying that Ozzy took his reputation for skull-crushing rock to literal extremes. And I'm sorry I don't have a soundboard, but you can put the drum sounds in yourself. Terrible, really. Like, oh, for fuck's sake. There you go. Took his reputation for skull-crushing rock to literal extremes. There you go. There was the punchline. I was bad at video. And this is interesting, because it's like, that's kind of gross. Very sensationalist, voyeuristic. Like, this is a guy that you're writing an obituary about. And, again, don't take him seriously. Don't take it too seriously. It's just metal. Don't take it seriously. The BBC was kind of unique. They were the only one that I could find to say, in reality, most of his behaviour was actually not very appealing or glamorous. It wasn't cool what he did. He was a wreck. And it was bad, to be fair. He strangled Sharon at one point. They had issues the whole way through their relationship. Like, into the last 10 years, But the BBC is kind of funny because they list all of these things first. They talk about all this stuff, like just a litany of things to be voyeuristic about, if you're the average reader. And then they say, oh, by the way, that wasn't good. I thought that was quite funny. So sensationalist. But then also, by the way, we don't endorse all this. Sky, I thought was interesting because they presume that the audience doesn't know anything about metal. So the way they introduced War Pigs was to compare it to an Arctic Monkeys song because they presume that the reader doesn't know War Pigs and won't look it up, but maybe they'll have heard the song Arabella by Arctic Monkeys. That was good. And the Telegraph's my favourite of these. Maybe my favourite one I read overall. Firstly, because it's really long and they put quite a lot of stuff that is very sensationalist in it. They just get on and on and on with this more and more details about, oh, did you know that he did this, and did you know that he bit the head off the bat, and did you know that this and that. And this is my favourite bit in the article, because they are sort of smirkingly treating him as a working class boy come good. They're saying, you know, isn't it nice, you know, ultimately, yes, he was imprisoned, and he did have the letters Ozzy tattooed on his knuckles, which he had self-applied, but he did come around. He maintained a subversive undertow, but he projected the image of a manic man grounded in family values. So easy to read Ozzy's legacy in this conservative light if you ignore, I don't know, this bit, the domestic issues. But according to the Telegraph, anyway, the country's most famously conservative newspaper, he was a manic man grounded in family values. They do mention the issues that Sharon and Ozzy had, but they only mention it in the penultimate sentence of the article, and the article is, I think, 2,500 words long or something. It's pretty long. It's in like in the final paragraph. They briefly mention that there had been issues there. Really, really interesting. But overall, these ones, these publications are more characterised by not taking Ozzy seriously in the sense of, look at this crazy guy who did this crazy shit. Isn't that wild? But ultimately, he became a family values guy. He became normal. He did the TV show, and we all love him, and that's great. That's what I would describe as normalisation. Just welcoming a redemption narrative that makes him into somebody who can be, you know, comported into establishment culture. And then there were some people in the middle. So New York Times, which was, say, reprinted in Irish Times, they got to do the bat thing in the subheadline, but also they do talk about, you know, they do acknowledge the musical stuff. So it was kind of a balance between the two approaches that I've mentioned. You've got NME's one, which was kind of similar, again, like a mix of, you know, talking about the music in a fairly sincere way, but then also talking about all of the stuff that he did in a pretty voyeuristic way. Daily Record, they spent a lot of time talking about like Ozzy's later life and like the last 10 years. Also mentioned all of the stuff that you've seen in the previous ones, but yeah, they spent a lot of time like reporting on what he did in the last 10 years, and lots of celeb gossip kind of oriented stuff. Like Sharon was mentioned a lot more in their one than in the others, which I think presumes a sort of like a sort of soaps and celeb gossip type of readership, which would stack given the Daily Record's like the version in the Mirror, so it's a tabloid. And the Independent filled in a lot of stuff from Twitter, X, formerly Twitter, because they needed to fill their article out, you know, so there was a lot of stuff where they just quoted from famous musicians that were leaving their tributes, whatever, fine, fodder. So how do you deal with Ozzy and his, to return to my question, how do you deal with Ozzy's abject and disturbing aesthetics, you know? How do you deal with him being a bat head biter? A guy who strangled his wife, guy who had addiction issues the whole way through his life, guy who did amazing music and also just could not like sort himself out once he got into drugs, you know? He got fucked up repeatedly, nearly died several times. It was bad. How do you deal with that? So, if you're right wing, you tend towards a kind of getting some distance from the guy. You need the guy, you need Ozzy because everyone likes him, and also he did perform in front of the Queen. He did donate all this money to local hospitals, you know, classic kind of noblesse oblige sort of thing. Also, Sharon is vociferously right wing in her own ways currently. Not going to get into that in any detail right here, but you know, like the Conservatives have got reason to bed down with the Ozzy Osbourne camp, yeah, but they can't like get too close to the senseless acts of violence. So you treat them sensationally. You treat them as this thing which is like, oh well, isn't that wild that he did that? But you know, ultimately he was a guy that did a cool TV show. If you're left wing and music press, which are pretty much de facto left wing, they are much more interested in saying, well, don't worry about the backbiting, yeah, but like maybe we can excuse the backbiting. Like the Guardian tried to excuse the backbiting, but the backbiting, the backbiting, the backbiting by saying, well, when he pissed, oh yeah, when it was about the Alamo pissing. And he said, well, when he pissed on the Alamo, he was really, really drunk and on drugs and stuff. And he apologised and donated money to the Alamo like conservation project afterwards. So it's like he bought his way back. And it's like, yeah, okay, why? Sure, we need to go and find the excuse. You know, we need to find the way that we can say no, Ozzy was good. We can't just have him being a great musician and somebody that did senseless acts of violence. We need to try and reconcile him. We need to try and make sense of those things, or maybe like massage the bad things in Ozzy a bit, so that we can have him as somebody that was ultimately musically and socially worthy. They're both approaches are looking to make this person's life acceptable, but different ways of approaching it. What they both do is, following Lacan, present Ozzy as having transgressions that are permissible. There are certain laws that Ozzy, or like moral rules, that Ozzy was allowed to break in the eyes of all of the authors of these publications. Most obviously being killing a small rodent, you know, with your mouth. This was allowed in a sense. This was excused by basically all of them, either as, well, he was a crazy guy who we like because he was a crazy guy who eventually saw sense, or it's excused or it's kind of, not excused, massaged. You know, they need to find a way to deal with this transgression. They need to permit it in some way because they're permitting the whole of Ozzy Osbourne into establishment culture. So they've got to figure out what to do with this nub of violence, basically. Because metal is replete with symbols of violence, you know? Like, look at this. What am I doing? Look at this guy. You know? We got a violent guy right here. These symbols are, or maybe, you know, the metal symbols that you're thinking of are like stuff like fire, or in like someone clutching their head, having what we understand to be some kind of insanity. You know, they're going mad, or you know what I mean. Metal symbols often tie back to things which are like mythic, religious, dare say, I use the phrase quasi-philosophical in my thesis a couple times, like terms which often refer to big, grand concepts, or things that are very old, things that we've had for a long time. And when you normalise metal, you have to deal with these symbols, and they often get flattened, or as Baudrillard observes, they when you throw everything into a mixture of different cultures, all of the symbols stop meaning the same things that they used to mean, and they turn into what's called floating signifiers, and this is an important. Ozzy's death was an important moment for the flotation of metal signifiers, as it were. You know, you've got to deal with this guy who bit the head off a bat. You've got to try and lessen the impact of this, try and make it less disturbing, this senseless act of violence, or the other senseless act of violence. So you've either got to kind of redeem him. The right-wing papers talked about kind of ways in which he came to or became normal, or he espoused family values. They try and save his reputation, but also kind of get a bit of distance. Or the left-wing papers talk about him more in terms of being a fool, and I mean somebody in the medieval sense who was able to speak truth to power, like a court jester. I think both approaches are kind of weaving between redemption and fooldom, right? Because the Telegraph on the one hand is saying family values, that's part of this kind of redemption art, but they're also saying, he was our transgressive idiot, he was our fool, he was our court jester. Whereas the left-wing papers are redeeming Ozzy in the sense of, look at the quality of this guy, look at the works that he's made, this is actually worthy, actually. But they're also identifying him in the position of a medieval jester, somebody who was allowed to say the truth, but wasn't taken seriously. And I think Ozzy did embody that. He was able in some ways to speak truth to power, but nobody took it seriously. I don't just mean war pigs. I mean the way in which he was not a perfect person, and he completely embodied that. He was out there being, incomplete and had issues and shit. And in that sense, he perfectly spoke the truth of his existence to the power of establishment culture, and they had to fucking deal with it. But they couldn't quite make, they couldn't quite make sense of these things. So they have to kind of find strategies to skirt around it. But that's really important for metal. These incidents are really important for metal. You can try and normalise the symbols of metal, the fire and the blood and the violence and stuff, but these violent episodes can't be, while they can't be excused in establishment media, they're essential to how people become metal fans. I think a lot of fans in the 80s probably got into metal by hearing about the backbiting story because it's fucking cool. And the real question is, why do metal participants, and lots of other people, it's not just metal, why do so many people think violence is so fucking cool? Why is that so important to us? Why is violence at the centre of culture? That is a totally different question that the newspapers that I looked at couldn't really deal with. They had to find a way of talking about Ozzy's violence and issues in a way that made sense of him, that either redeemed him or allowed them to take some ironic distance from him, or presented him in a noble light, or whatever it is. Nobody was able to deal with how that violence, in all of its senselessness, has a distinct appeal of its own. And as metal becomes more normalised, the issue, potentially, is that this relationship between metal and violence is going to get missed. If we only think of metal as something which is, good for people, if that becomes the popular understanding of what metal is, that it's this violent music that we shouldn't take seriously because ultimately the violence isn't real, it's actually just helping people. If that were to become a prevalent understanding, I'm not saying that it will, but I'm saying that the way in which metal is being normalised presently is skirting around the essential relationship between enjoyment and violence, which metal makes so clear, and this is an omission. Anyway, I'll stop now. Cheers.